Here in the beautiful Dandenong Ranges is the site of the deadliest aviation crash in the history of Melbourne. This can here remembers the 18 people who were killed when an Australian National Airways Douglas DC-2 aeroplane crashed straight into the side of Mount Dandenong over 80 years ago. In today's video, we're going to look back at what was then Australia's worst aviation disaster and investigate what happened. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that the topic for this video was suggested by a viewer in a YouTube comment. So thank you very much to James Oz7727 for suggesting it. At 11:22 AM on the 25th of October 1938, a Douglas DC-2 took off on a scheduled flight from Parafield Airport in Adelaide, bound for Essendon Airport in Melbourne. This aeroplane with the name Kyeema was operated by Australian National Airways, commonly known as ANA. At the time, it was a relatively new airline. It began life in 1932 as Flinders Island Airways, operating flights between Launceston in Tasmania and Flinders Island in the Bass Strait, before becoming the Tasmanian Aerial Services later in the same year. After a series of commercial amalgamations and restructures, the airline was reconstituted as Australian National Airways in collaboration with Adelaide Airways in July 1936. Back to the DC-2 that's taken off from Adelaide, its route took it in a fairly direct line southwest towards its final destination of Essendon. Commercial aviation at this time was still very much in its infancy, and crashes and incidents were common as aviation safety and technology was absolute bare bones. Almost none of the navigation aids that pilots use today were available at the time, and they more or less relied on visual techniques like identifying landmarks, radio transmitters, and limited air traffic control. On that particular day, there were 18 people on board. The crew was made up of a captain and first officer, a cadet pilot flying here on part of his training, and one cabin crew. They were taking 14 passengers on this flight. This included Federal Member of Parliament for Wakefield in South Australia, Charles Hawker. There were also 3 prominent winemakers from South Australia, 5 lawyers, a couple on their honeymoon, a businessman, and an older couple taking their first ever flight. As the Kyeema took off from Adelaide, the weather was perfect for flying. The aircraft headed east towards Melbourne over western and then central Victoria, where the weather began to turn. It was at this point that their problems began. The heavy fog and low cloud that they now experienced caused them to lose their bearings. Instead of tracking towards Essendon, they flew well north of where they were supposed to be. The crew radioed Essendon Airport for weather information, which they were told was cloud cover between 1,500 and 4,000 feet, which will become important later. It's not known exactly where Kyeema veered off its intended course, as GPS had not yet been invented, but a sighting on the ground had it tracking slightly further north of its usual route as far back as Daylesford. In any case, as they continued flying and preparing for their approach, without any visual aids to guide them in the cloud, they had badly miscalculated their position. This took them far east of where they thought they were and towards the Dandenong Ranges. Now at its highest point, Mount Dandenong is 633 metres high, or just over 2,000 feet. If you'll remember from earlier, this meant that its top 500 feet or so were enveloped in the cloud. This also meant that as the Kyeema descended towards what they thought was Essendon Airport, they were now in fact heading straight for the side of the mountain. The occupants of the DC-2 would have had no warning of what was about to happen until the very last second. And at about 1:45 PM, the Kyeema slammed into the tall trees on the slopes of Mount Dandenong. The propellers were the first to strike, shearing off branches and leaves, until the wings were torn off the fuselage and the aircraft exploded into a fireball. All 18 people died in the crash. This caused a small bushfire as the surrounding vegetation was ignited by the explosion. There were almost immediate reports of the incident, although air traffic control at Essendon continued trying to contact the Kyeema for some time. The investigation after this crash and its findings proved to be a significant moment for aviation in Australia. The cause of the crash was quickly found to be human error, although there were many factors in play. Fatefully, many navigation beacons that could have avoided this crash along the way had been installed, but just had not yet been activated. Most crucially, Essendon Airport itself was fitted with a beacon that would allow aircraft to follow its signal, but this had actually been turned off due to budget cuts. The subsequent report strongly condemned the existing arrangements for aviation in Australia and made several recommendations. The government, facing strong public pressure to take action in the wake of this disaster, rapidly adopted and implemented these changes, which at the time were among the most progressive in the world. They included installing radio beacons at all Australian airports, mandating all aeroplanes carry radios, and creating a new Department of Civil Aviation, separate to the current arrangement under the Department of Defence. These and other changes set the foundation for modern air traffic control in Australia, which today safely coordinates thousands of flights every day. The flight attendant killed in the crash, Elva Jones, was not actually meant to be on board. 24-year-old Gladys Allen was the original flight attendant rostered on that day, but was ill that morning and not able to fly, so Elva took her place instead. Gladys Allen was understandably deeply affected by this and would not speak about the death of her colleague, but in an interview with the Australian Women's Weekly said that it would not impact her thoughts on safety and carrying on with her job. Today you can visit the site where the Kyeema came to rest. It's hidden in bushland near Burke's Lookout at the top of Mount Dandenong, and there is a cairn with a small plaque and an information board explaining the disaster. As for ANA, it fell victim to the Two Airlines Agreement of 1952 that restricted airline operations in most of Australia to just two airlines, mostly Ansett and Trans-Australia Airlines, known as TAA. ANA was bought by Ansett and merged to form Ansett-ANA in October 1957, before finally becoming just Ansett Airlines in 1968. The Kyeema remains Victoria's worst aviation disaster by death toll, and the 12th deadliest in Australia's history. As I said, it was a watershed moment for Australian air travel and laid the foundations for many of the things that we take for granted today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more, please subscribe to the channel so that you can stay up to date on future videos. Also, feel free to check out my supporters portal, where you can sign up for bonus content like early video access and extra footage at members.philipmallis.com. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.